My husband's younger sister ruined my wedding, but I didn't think I would be grateful to her for it. I've rewritten this story in my mind more times than I can count, wondering where exactly things began to spiral. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The ceremony was set for the second Saturday of June. A small, peaceful chapel tucked in the countryside near Lyon, Saint Auguste de Bois, was where I was going to marry Laurent, the man I'd loved for nearly 6 years. The air was warm with early summer, the scent of lavender and roses drifting in through the open church doors. A quartet was rehearsing softly in the background as I stood in the back room, trying to keep my hands from shaking. My best friend, Camille, helped me fix the train of my dress while I adjusted my veil. "You look amazing, Elodie," she whispered, smiling warmly. "Laurent is going to be completely stunned." I smiled back at her through the mirror, grateful for her calming presence. Camille had been like a sister to me since our university days in Bordeaux, and she knew exactly when I needed reassurance and when I needed silence. But the calm didn't last. Just as I was checking my earrings, we heard raised voices from the main entrance. Not joyful chatter, shouting. I felt my stomach clench as Camille moved to peek through the crack in the door. "I'm not sure," she said with a furrowed brow. "There's a crowd forming, something's wrong." Before we could say anything else, my father, who was supposed to walk me down the aisle, appeared in the doorway. He looked pale. "Elodie, sweetheart," he said gently, "we have a bit of a situation." And then, she burst in. Sophie. Laurent's younger sister. Her cheeks were flushed, her voice sharp. She didn't hesitate. "You," she pointed straight at me. "How dare you come here pretending like nothing happened? You stole it. My emerald ring, our grandmother's ring. It's gone, and you took it." The room fell into complete silence. I felt my heart begin to race, thudding painfully against my ribs. What? I barely managed to say. "I don't even know what ring you're talking about." But Sophie wasn't listening. She was shouting now, accusing me louder and louder, her voice echoing into the hallway and, surely, into the chapel itself. I glanced at my father, who looked absolutely stunned. Camille stood frozen beside me, her hand still clutching the edge of my veil. Then Laurent appeared behind his sister. His expression was unreadable at first. But his voice was hard. "Elodie," he said. "Is it true?" I looked at him, tears instantly filling my eyes. "You can't possibly believe this," I said, my voice cracking. "I didn't take anything." His jaw clenched. "Then where is the ring? My sister doesn't lie about this kind of thing." Those words cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever known. People were starting to gather behind him, guests, family members, murmuring, whispering. The entire chapel was turning into a courtroom, and I was suddenly on trial. Camille tried to step in, telling everyone to calm down. My father stood between me and Sophie, who was still hurling accusations. But Laurent just stood there. Silent. Watching me as though I were a stranger. The pressure in the room was suffocating. I felt the weight of judgment from every angle. The air had turned cold. And then, finally, Laurent spoke again. "If you really didn't take it, then just give it back, Elodie. We can still fix this. But if not, the wedding is off." I couldn't breathe. How could the man I loved say something like that? I wanted to scream, but my voice barely rose above a whisper. "I didn't take anything. How can you not know that about me?" Tears were running down my face now. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know what to believe." That was the moment I knew. If he could stand here, on our wedding day, and question my integrity, then maybe he was never really mine to begin with. I turned to my father. "Take me home," I said. Camille grabbed my arm protectively. Behind us, Laurent called my name, but I didn't turn around. I stepped out of the church into the sunlight, still in my wedding dress, and felt the warmth hit my face like an insult. It should have been a perfect day. It was the worst day of my life. I didn't cry in the car on the way back. I just sat there, motionless, staring out the window as the rolling countryside blurred past. The wedding dress still clung to me like a cruel joke, white satin and lace, pristine, meant for a day of joy. But it felt like it was suffocating me. Camille held my hand the whole ride back to my apartment. My father sat silently in the front, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. He didn't say a word, but every now and then I could see him glance at me through the mirror, his eyes dark with helplessness. When we reached my building, I didn't speak. I climbed the stairs slowly, step by step, like someone climbing out of a grave. The weight of my dress, my disappointment, my shame, it all pulled me down. Camille helped me unlock the door, and my father stood guard like a sentinel while we slipped inside and closed the world out behind us. I didn't even make it to my bedroom. I walked straight into the bathroom and turned the faucet on. I needed to see myself. I needed to understand what I had become in the span of a single afternoon. The mirror showed me someone I didn't recognize. My makeup was smeared, my eyes red and swollen. There was a welt forming along my left cheek, faint but unmistakable, from the moment Laurent lost control. He hadn't meant to. At least, I don't think he had. But does that even matter? When you love someone, truly love them, they're not supposed to raise a hand to you. Not even once. And yet he had. In front of people. In a cafe. Because I dared to deny a lie. I peeled the dress off slowly, letting it crumple to the floor. I stared at it for a long time. It looked like something torn out of a fairy tale, except the ending was all wrong. In the shower, I let the hot water wash over me until my skin turned pink. My tears mixed with the steam, and for once, I let them fall freely. There was no one to hide from anymore. No performance to maintain. Just the echo of everything that should have been, and everything that would never be. By the time I stepped out, wrapped in a towel and hollowed out by exhaustion, Camille and my father were waiting in the living room. She had made tea. He was pacing. Elodie, my father said carefully, we should consider going to the authorities. What he did, it wasn't right. I can't, I said. My voice felt thin, almost non-existent. Not now. He didn't push. He just nodded, eyes full of worry. Camille placed her hand over mine again, like she'd done in the church. I'll stay tonight, she said. You shouldn't be alone. I didn't argue. I couldn't. The idea of waking up in the middle of the night, disoriented and alone, scared me more than I wanted to admit. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the silence of my apartment heavier than any blanket. Camille was asleep on the couch, just down the hall, but her presence felt like a thread keeping me tied to the real world. My mind refused to shut off. Every moment from the previous day kept replaying, the accusation, the crowd, the look in Laurent's eyes, the disbelief in his voice. The moment I realized that trust had left our relationship long before that ring ever did. And then, the slap. The way the cafe went silent. My father lunging forward. Strangers staring. My life unraveling in real time. As the sun began to rise, I made a quiet promise to myself. I wouldn't let this day define the rest of my life. I didn't know what healing would look like yet, but I had to find a way forward, however long it took. The next morning came far too soon. I was woken by a sharp sting in my cheek and a sense of overwhelming heaviness. My eyes were dry, but the ache remained. I pulled myself out of bed and padded into the kitchen. The soft hum of the fridge was the only sound in the apartment. I started the kettle. As the water boiled, I stared at my phone sitting on the counter. I had turned it off after we got back. I didn't want to see the messages, the missed calls, the pity, the questions. But I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. I turned it on. It buzzed constantly for a full minute, messages from friends, relatives, colleagues. Some were confused. Some were worried. A few were angry. I scrolled through them without opening a single one. Then I saw his name. Laurent. 3 missed calls. 4 unread messages. And 1 voicemail. I didn't listen. Not yet. Camille came into the kitchen, her hair still a mess, wearing one of my old sweatshirts. You okay? She asked. I shrugged. As okay as someone can be after their fiancé believes a lie and hits them in public. She sat across from me, wrapping her hands around a mug. I know it feels like everything's collapsed, but this isn't the end, ELO. You can start again. You will. I smiled faintly. You sound so sure. That's because I know you. You're stronger than you think. I wanted to believe her. I wasn't sure I could just yet. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was my mother. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me, and I broke down in her arms. She'd come with food, clothes, and the kind of maternal love that only comes from someone who's watched their child break and still believes in their healing. By evening, my father returned. The three of them, my parents and Camille, formed a wall of quiet support. They didn't push me to talk. They didn't ask me what came next. They just made sure I wasn't alone. Then, at almost 6 p.m., my phone rang again. It was Laurent. The room went silent. Everyone looked at me. "You don't have to answer," my father said calmly. "But if you do, we'll be right here." I nodded and walked into my bedroom, closing the door behind me. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely audible. "Elodie," Laurent's voice came through the line. It was hoarse, almost broken. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me." I didn't say anything. I let him continue. "I made a mistake. A horrible one. And I know it's too late, but you have to know. I found the ring. My sister had it. She misplaced it." The breath left my body in a single exhale. Of course. Of course it was something so simple. So absurd. "She had it in her drawer," Laurent continued. "She doesn't even remember putting it there. And instead of checking, she just assumed." And he stopped himself. "And you believed her," I whispered. "You didn't believe me." "I know," he said. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you the truth." There was a long silence. Finally, I said, "I'm glad you found it. But it doesn't change what happened." "I understand," he said quietly. I wish I could take it all back." I hung up before I started crying again. That night, I slept deeper than I had in days. Not because I felt better, but because the truth had finally surfaced. And now, I could begin to think about what came next. The morning after the call with Laurent, I woke with an odd clarity. The sky outside my window was cloudless, but my world still felt heavy. The pain in my cheek had faded into a dull ache, and though the swelling had gone down, the bruise was still visible. It stared back at me from the mirror like a question I didn't want to answer. Camille was in the kitchen again, making coffee, moving softly to avoid waking my parents who had stayed the night. She looked up as I entered, her expression a careful mix of concern and quiet encouragement. "How are you?" she asked. "I don't even know," I said truthfully. I sat across from her, wrapping my hands around the warm mug she handed me. "It's like I'm still watching it all happen, except it's done. It already happened. And now I have to live with it." "You don't have to do anything today," she said gently. "No calls, no decisions. Just breathe." But I knew that wasn't entirely true. The world was still waiting. There were vendors to cancel. Guests to inform. A honeymoon I would no longer be taking. My dress still lay crumpled on the bathroom floor, untouched since I peeled it off in grief. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message, not from Laurent, but from his sister. "Chloe." It was brief. "I heard you spoke to Laurent. I'm sorry if things got out of hand. I never meant for it to go that far." "That far?" I didn't respond. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed, and then I deleted it. Some apologies are only meant to ease guilt, not offer healing. I spent the rest of the day curled up on the couch while Camille took over. She made calls to the florist and the caterer. She wrote a message for the wedding guests on my behalf, letting them know the event had been postponed indefinitely. She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. My mother folded laundry in the corner, my father paced on the balcony with a cup of tea. The silence in the apartment was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was the sound of people standing guard. By evening, Camille sat beside me on the sofa, her laptop open, casually clicking through photos of places she thought we should escape to. "Not forever," she said. "But for a while. You need to get out of this place." I didn't answer at first. Then she said something that stayed with me. "You keep asking yourself why he didn't believe you. But maybe the real question is, why did you believe he would?" It wasn't cruel. It was honest. And it landed somewhere deep in my chest. Because she was right. Laurent had always been indecisive. Insecure. He hated confrontation, avoided responsibility when it came to his family. I had seen it time and time again. But I had excused it. Overlooked it. Because I loved him. Or maybe, I had just loved the idea of him. A few days later, while sitting in the courtyard beneath my apartment, I found myself writing again. Not journaling this time, but writing a letter. To myself. I didn't write about the wedding. Or the dress. Or even the slap. I wrote about who I wanted to become. I wanted to be the kind of woman who didn't just survive things, she transformed through them. I wanted to be someone who took back her story. Someone who didn't live in the echo of other people's opinions or mistakes. I wanted to rediscover who I had been before everything became about someone else. And that desire, the quiet, fragile seed of it, was enough to get me to open my laptop. Camille had a friend, Luc, who worked in travel logistics. She connected us quickly. Within a day, he sent me a list of places that were quiet, peaceful, and, most importantly, far away. One option stood out, a small coastal town in southern Thailand, where Luc's friend operated a dive center. They were looking for someone to assist with administrative work and online communications, website, emails, guest bookings. Nothing fancy, but something solid. The idea was absurd. I'd spent years building a career in corporate finance, the polished skyline of Paris always just outside my office window. Trading that for a place I'd never heard of, on an island I couldn't pronounce. But somehow, that absurdity made it perfect. The next day, I submitted my request for extended leave. My boss, who had already heard rumors of the wedding disaster, was surprisingly kind. You don't need to explain, he said over the phone. Just take what time you need. 2 weeks later, I was gone. The air in Thailand was thicker, warmer, and alive with sound. I arrived late in the evening. The scent of lemongrass and sea salt hung in the breeze. Mark, the dive center manager, picked me up at the small harbor. He was tall, sun-weathered, with kind eyes and a relaxed demeanor that immediately put me at ease. You must be Elodie, he said, smiling. Luc said you could use a change of scenery. That's putting it mildly, I replied. The bungalow they'd arranged for me was small but clean, nestled between palm trees just a short walk from the beach. And for the first time in months, I slept soundly. No nightmares. No noise in my head. Just the sound of waves outside my window. My days quickly fell into a gentle rhythm. Mornings were spent helping Mark organize the calendar, respond to guest emails, manage bookings. Afternoons were free. I wandered the beaches, photographed the local wildlife, and slowly began to breathe like a human being again. And then something unexpected happened. Mark saw my photos. You've got an eye, he said, scrolling through my shots of the reef and the boats. Would you consider shooting some of our promo content? I hadn't thought of myself as a photographer. But I said yes. And that yes opened a door. It didn't erase what had happened. Nothing ever could. But each day, I felt more like myself. Or maybe, someone better than who I used to be. Someone free. One afternoon, after returning from a dive trip, I stood barefoot in the sand, watching the sun dip into the sea. I opened my phone and typed a short message to my former boss back in Paris. Hi Jean. I hope you're well. Just wanted to say, I don't think I'll be coming back. It was terrifying to hit send. But I did. His reply came an hour later. I'm not surprised. You sound happy. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. I turned off my phone, walked back to the bungalow, and sat on the porch listening to the waves. I was finally beginning to understand something I hadn't before. Sometimes, a life falling apart isn't the end. It's the beginning of the one you were meant to live all along. It had been 4 months since I left France. 4 months since I'd stepped off that plane in Thailand with a suitcase full of loose ends and a heart split down the middle. And yet, somewhere between the coral reefs and quiet mornings spent watching fishermen haul nets from the sea, I had found something I hadn't felt in years. Myself. I'd settled into a rhythm that felt less like running and more like arriving. The bungalow became my sanctuary. The dive center, once foreign, now felt familiar. Mark had become a trusted friend, the kind who didn't ask questions when he saw me staring off into space for long stretches of time. Photography had become more than a distraction, it had turned into a new language. Through my lens, I learned to see the world differently. A child laughing in the surf. The shimmer of a clownfish hiding in an anemone. Sunlight filtering through water like stained glass. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing a version of happiness someone else had written for me. I was writing it myself. One warm afternoon in late October, Mark and I sat on the porch of the dive shop, drinking chilled tea. The monsoon season was approaching, and the island was slowly beginning to quiet down. "You've changed a lot," he said casually, not looking at me. "Luke told me a bit about what happened. But I think the sea did the rest of the healing." I smiled faintly. "It's strange. I still think about him. Laurent. But it's like remembering a book I once loved that ended terribly. I don't miss the story. I just remember the hope I had at the beginning." Mark nodded. "Some stories are just meant to end. Doesn't mean they weren't real while they lasted." I thought about that long after he left. It wasn't that I wanted to forget Laurent. Or even what happened. It was that I needed to remember it honestly, without letting it define who I was becoming. One evening, I sat down with my camera and a notebook. I started writing something new, not a letter, not a journal entry. Something closer to a story. Not about betrayal. But about resilience. About a woman who lost everything in the space of a day and still found a way to begin again. I didn't write her name. But I knew it was me. Sophie finally came to visit in December. She showed up with 2 suitcases, a sun hat, and a big grin. "Oh, Elle," she said as she hugged me tightly. "You're glowing. You look like someone who got out just in time." We spent our days snorkeling, biking, and catching up under the stars. One night, while sitting on the sand, she asked me, "Do you think you'll ever go back?" I didn't answer right away. "Back? To Paris? To my old life?" "I don't think there's a back for me anymore," I said eventually. "Only forward." She nodded slowly. "You know, it's kind of poetic. You thought your life was ending when the wedding fell apart. But in a way, that moment gave birth to something better." I threw a pebble into the waves. "It still hurts sometimes. Not every day. But in quiet moments." "That's okay," she said. "Healing isn't about erasing pain. It's about learning to live around it." I continued working at the dive center, and eventually, Mark asked if I'd consider staying long-term. He'd seen how I handled guests, how I captured the magic of the island with my camera. "We could use someone like you," he said. "And I think maybe, you need this place as much as it needs you." He was right. I accepted. I found a small house on the edge of the village, surrounded by banana trees and songbirds. I bought a used motorbike and started offering photography sessions to visiting couples and travelers. The irony wasn't lost on me, capturing love stories, after what I'd been through. But it didn't sting. It felt right. Because I understood something they didn't yet: love is beautiful. But it should never cost you your dignity. Or your peace. Sometimes, I still think about that day in the chapel. I remember the way the light streamed through the stained glass. The smell of roses. The sound of Camille whispering, "You're going to be okay." She was right. I didn't know it then, but she was right. The final time I heard from Laurent was an email. Months after the truth had come out. He didn't ask for anything. He just said that he was still in therapy, and that he hoped I'd found happiness. And in a small way, I was glad he was trying. But I didn't reply. Not out of anger. But because I had nothing left to give to that chapter. It had closed. On the 1-year anniversary of the wedding that wasn't, I stood barefoot in the sand, camera slung over my shoulder, watching a young couple exchange vows in the golden light. The bride wore a flower crown. The groom cried openly as he read his vows. They didn't know my story. But I whispered a silent blessing for them anyway. Not forever. But truth. Kindness. Mutual belief. The kind of love that doesn't ask you to prove your worth. Later that night, I stood on my porch with a mug of tea and my journal open on my lap. I wrote 6 simple words. I am not who I was. And I smiled. Because I wasn't. Thank you for watching the video. like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.